This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a declassified government document. The United States government, for nearly 2 decades, deliberately exposed its own citizens without their knowledge, without their consent to chemical and biological agents, and for a long time, nobody was supposed to know. Let's talk about Operation Seaspray, Project Shad, and the program that sits above them both, the US military's covert testing program that ran from the late 1940s all the way into the 1960s. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the world these decisions were made in. It's 1949. World War II just ended 4 years ago. The Cold War is beginning. The Soviet Union has just tested its first nuclear bomb, and American military planners are terrified, not just of nuclear weapons, but of something potentially more dangerous, biological and chemical warfare. The fear wasn't irrational. During World War II, Japan had run extensive biological weapons programs, experimenting on prisoners in Manchuria. Germany had developed nerve agents. The threat of mass casualty chemical and biological attacks on US cities felt very real. So the Pentagon asked a question that, on paper, sounded like defense planning. If an enemy released a biological agent over one of our cities, how far would it spread? How many people would be exposed? How do we model this? Reasonable question, deeply unreasonable answer. Their solution was to actually do it. To release agents over real American cities, on real American people, without telling anyone. The justification, as it would later be framed in declassified documents, was that they needed real-world data. Simulations weren't good enough. They needed to know how aerosol clouds behaved in actual urban environments, in real weather, around real buildings, inhaled by real human lungs. And so they began. September 1950, the city of San Francisco. For 6 days, a US Navy vessel sailed back and forth just outside the Golden Gate, releasing a fine aerosol mist into the air. The mist contained 2 types of bacteria, Serratia marcescens, chosen partly because it produces a distinctive red pigment that makes it easy to track, and Bacillus globig. The Navy's position at the time was that these bacteria were harmless, inert, just tracers to measure how far a biological cloud would travel through an urban environment. Within weeks of the spraying, patients began showing up at Stanford University Hospital with a rare and dangerous infection, Serratia marcescens. It was the first significant cluster of this infection ever recorded at the hospital. One man, Edward Nevin, a retired pipefitter who had recently undergone urinary tract surgery, developed a severe Serratia infection. He died 11 days after being admitted. His family wouldn't learn the possible connection to the Navy's secret spraying for decades. When documents were finally declassified and a journalist pieced the timeline together, the military's official assessment, even after the deaths, the tests were a success. The aerosol cloud had traveled 20 miles inland. It had covered the entire city. San Francisco was not alone. Declassified records would eventually reveal that the military conducted over 200 open-air tests across the United States between 1949 and 1969. Over 200 cities included Minneapolis, St. Louis, New York City, and dozens of others. In St. Louis, in the early 1950s, and again in the early 1960s, a powder containing zinc cadmium sulfide was sprayed from rooftops and motorized blowers in low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, including areas near public housing projects filled with children. Residents were told, if they were told anything at all, that the military was testing a smokescreen to protect against potential Soviet air attacks. Zinc cadmium sulfide. Cadmium is a heavy metal now classified as a known carcinogen. It wasn't just civilians. Project Shad, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, was a series of tests conducted in the 1960s in which US military personnel were directly exposed to chemical and biological agents, again without full disclosure of what was being released or the potential risks involved. Sailors aboard US Navy ships were used as test subjects. Ships were deliberately sprayed with agents, including VX nerve agent, one of the most toxic substances ever synthesized by humans, as well as sarin, and various biological agents. Veterans who participated in Project Shad reported for decades that they suffered unusual and serious health problems, neurological damage, cancers, chronic illnesses, but because the program was classified, they couldn't get answers. The VA wouldn't acknowledge the connection. Their service records contained gaps. Some were told the tests they remembered never happened. It took until 2002, more than 40 years after the tests, for the Department of Defense to officially acknowledge Project Shad and begin notifying veterans who had participated. By then, many were already dead. A study conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs found that Shad participants had statistically higher rates of several serious diseases compared to control groups of veterans who had not participated in the tests. These were men who served their country, who followed orders, who had no idea what was being sprayed on them, and the government's response, for 4 decades, was silence. Here's what makes this particularly significant from a legal standpoint. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, just 2 years before these programs began, explicitly states that voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential in any experiment. It was written directly in response to the medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors during World War II. The United States was a signatory. American prosecutors had argued for those principles at Nuremberg, and 2 years later, American military planners began releasing bacteria over American cities. The programs operated under a classified framework that kept them invisible to Congress, to the public, and to the people being exposed. There was no informed consent. In many cases, there was no consent of any kind. When some of these programs were eventually investigated by the Senate in the 1970s, as part of a broader inquiry into government misconduct that also uncovered MKUltra, the CIA's mind control research program, the response from officials was largely the same. It was a different time. The threat was real. The protocols were appropriate for the era. The people of San Francisco didn't get a vote on being part of that era. The secrecy wasn't accidental. It was structural. These programs were classified at levels that kept them away from civilian oversight. Local governments weren't notified. Health departments weren't informed. When illnesses followed the spraying operations, there was no mechanism connecting the dots because the dots were hidden. When Edward Nevin's family sued the U.S. government in 1981, a federal judge ruled against them. The government's defense rested partly on the state secrets privilege, the legal doctrine that allows the government to withhold information from courts on national security grounds. The family couldn't get the evidence. The government controlled the evidence. Journalists and researchers who began piecing these stories together in the 1970s and 1980s did so almost entirely through Freedom of Information Act requests, document by document, often receiving heavily redacted files. The full picture took decades to emerge, and even now, researchers believe there are programs that remain classified. That's how a cover-up at this scale works. Not one dramatic moment of concealment, but layers, classification, compartmentalization, bureaucratic distance between the people giving orders and the people breathing the results. The programs are documented. The Senate hearings are in the public record. The Defense Department's own acknowledgments are on its website. These are not fringe claims. What they raise and what has never been fully resolved is the question of accountability. Who was responsible? Were the health consequences ever properly studied? Were the people affected, the residents of St. Louis, the sailors of Project Shad, the people of San Francisco, ever made whole? The short answer, largely no. Some veterans received acknowledgement, some received additional healthcare access, but no criminal charges were ever filed. No official government apology was ever issued for the civilian exposure programs. The deeper question these programs leave behind isn't really about bacteria or chemical agents. It's about the relationship between a government and the people it claims to protect. About what happens when the word classified becomes a mechanism to make accountability impossible. And about how many programs like this we simply don't know about yet, because the documents are still locked away. That's the story of Operation Seaspray. That's Project Shad. That's 200 open-air tests over 20 years, on American soil. Not a theory. A document trail. Subscribe for the next one.